Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing the Black interior. I'm Pat Zerke. For 37 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. With her keen observations about a broad range of African American artifacts, poems, films, photographs, paintings, poet Elizabeth Alexander examines Black life and creativity behind the public face of stereotype and limited imagination, and asks what these images reveal about us, artist and audience, creator and consumer, Black and white, in America today. Elizabeth Alexander is the author of 3 collections of poetry, including her acclaimed debut collection, The Venus Hottentot, and most recently, Antebellum Dream Book. She has received grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation, and she currently teaches English and African American Studies at Yale University. Her new collection of essays, The Black Interior, serves as the basis for our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to read to you from the preface of the book, which gives a sense of why I wrote it. It begins with a quotation. "Today, as the news from Selma and Saigon poisons the air like fallout," wrote the poet Robert Hayden in the late 1960s, "I come again to see the serene, great picture that I love." In Hayden's poem, culture consoles, and the artifact stands as a record of the human trace, a history of the individual voice and collective living spirit. Art is where and how we speak to each other in tongues audible when official language fails. It is not where we escape the world's ills, but rather one place where we go to make sense of them. Each day's news brings word of human atrocity and violation, as too many of us linger in pernicious and calcified ideas of who the other is. In desperate times, when a citizen's raised voice seems to make no difference at all, it feels useful to turn again to the art and popular culture with which we speak across difference from each to say, this is who I am, and thus this is who we collectively are. What might we hope for and work toward? Culture is one way I take in the world and venture beyond my boundaries, where I often find politics as well as aesthetic joy so deep I experience it in my bones, where I shift and have sometimes shifted others through writing and teaching. The work I do is culture work, and culture is what calls many of us into the conundrums of the public sphere. Culture and politics need not present an either-or proposition if politics is restored to its original meaning of the polis, the village, the community. Sometimes we encounter truths in culture not necessarily verifiable against census records or voting rolls. Sometimes in culture we find what we are hoping for before we have been able to articulate or enact it. African American people are seen, imagined, and imagined known through sociological and fantasy discourses, but the troves of our culture offer enlightening angles of vision. What unites these essays is an idea, a metaphor of what I call the Black interior. That is, Black life and creativity behind the public face of stereotype and limited imagination. The Black interior takes us beyond the Black public everyday, toward power and wild imagination that Black people ourselves know we possess but need to be reminded of. It is a space that Black people ourselves have policed at various historical moments. Tapping into this Black imaginary helps us envision what we are not meant to envision: complex Black selves, real and enactable Black power, rampant and unfetishized Black beauty. What do we learn when we pause at sites of contradiction where Black creativity complicates and resists what Blackness is supposed to be? What in our culture speaks, sustains, and survives post-nationalism, post-racial romance into the unwritten Black future we must imagine? and then to take you through a few of the essays, some of the examples that I look to in the culture. I wanted first to tell you a bit about the essay called The Black Poet as Canon Maker, Langston Hughes and the Road to New Negro Poets, USA. Little has been written about Langston Hughes, the anthologizer. Of course, we think of him as a poet. He was quite prolific in many genres, but not much said about his anthology work and his role as a shaper of African American culture as well as a maker of it. His lifelong encouragement of younger writers is well known, but more ambitiously, his supporting impulse also represents a move to shape American literature by making the work of black writers available, and to shape African American poetry by putting forth a canon that would articulate a literature that grew and developed dramatically over the course of Hughes's life. Hughes, as anthologizer, demonstrates his participation in the making of the context in which his own work would be read and placed, as well as his responsibility, as he perceived it, to his literary community. And his edited collection, New Negro Poets USA, which was published in 1964 after a long and noteworthy and fraught incubation, allows us to think about African American canon formation at the beginning of a decade of quite dramatic change. New Negro Poets was Hughes's last solo take on the African American literary scene. He died in 1967. And it's a case study of how even the clearest cultural vision can become distorted on its way to public availability. The final book is never what it starts out to be, and the case of New Negro Poets speaks to the times, to white visions of black poetry, and to the making of a cultural anthology by a black poet. The book was published by Indiana University Press, and by consulting the letters between Hughes and the director of the press, Bruce Perry, Hughes and all of the writers who he put in the book, we see that when he first put forth a version of what he thought, and he was quite an expert on the matter, New Negro Poets should look like, the book took 5 years to make its way to the public. The press was decidedly underwhelmed. They said that definitely the good stuff has little that is specifically Negro about it. It is not the naive dictum we have become accustomed to expect from our colored brethren. He changes the table of contents around. He is then asked for work that is more avant-garde. He can't win. So either the work it's too black or it's not black enough, black being defined by Indiana University Press, which has no track record with putting forth any vision of black culture. And if you can imagine, Hughes at that point in his life is quite the authority. Finally, when the book is published, after all of those years of wrangling back and forth, we've moved forward in time. Leroy Jones has become Amiri Baraka. His work has changed dramatically. He's writing to Hughes saying, why don't you put some of this new work? Hughes is having his secretary post diplomatic replies saying, we can't print that language because we want this book to get into the schools. And what was called New Negro Poetry is actually now black poetry. And the book ends up being a sort of compromised fossil, all in the space of those 5 years, because of the difficulty of Hughes's navigating the straits to have some version of his vision make its way to the public, and the book ends up being quite anachronistic and is not particularly well received. Then, in the next essay, Meditations on Mecca, Gwendolyn Brooks and the Responsibility of the Black Poet, I take us to the spring of 1967. Famously tumultuous times, Gwendolyn Brooks attends the second Fisk University Black Writers Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, in the midst of the Tet Offensive and the U.S. response, the Watts riots. The Black Panther Party has been founded. I don't need to tell you what those times were all about. And Gwendolyn Brooks finds herself in a moment at the age of 50, though she has already won the Pulitzer Prize, she's raised children, she's quite a senior woman, at a moment of rebirth as far as her black consciousness goes. At that same time, the poet Robert Hayden is saying, when asked, are you a poet first or black first? Because that was one of the questions of the day. Make a choice. Are you a poet first or black first? Hayden says, to put it succinctly, I feel that Afro-American poets ought to be looked at as poets first, if that's what they truly are. And as one of them, I dare to hope that if my work means anything, if it's any good at all, it's going to have a human impact, not a narrowly racial or ethnic or political or over-specialized impact. And so from that moment forward, you have Brooks and Hayden kind of placed at opposites to each other. That Brooks is the newly awakened senior race woman, right, who's sort of down with the program in a certain kind of way. And Hayden, some people even thought of him as an Uncle Tom, even though as early in the 1940s, he had written remarkable works such as Middle Passage, such as Frederick Douglass, work that in the contemporary era defined what a righteous black history poem could be. And I wanted to really go back and look at what those two writers were publishing at that moment in time and think a little bit more about how they defined their career, which, of course, as you can imagine, is not nearly as dichotomized as came to become sort of the common lore. That made me able to talk about how black writers know the perils of white racism and racist judgments against us in our work. It's a straightforward, if unpleasant, navigation for any African American. But we are also, as ever, faced with judgments and injunctions from within our community, that our work should perform a certain service, as well as say or not say what is empowering or embarrassing to the race at large. The pressure on creative work can be intense for artists who belong to groups still struggling for their fair shake in society. The challenge to be published and heard, let alone to write well, lead to the understandable conclusion that every word counts. Those who wish for justice for the race would also wish their words could further the cause. However, controversially, that cause might be defined. The expectations placed on black poets by the larger public are one thing, but what about those demands that are placed on the poet from one's own people? I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting my own work to be useful, to find a voice that speaks to people and communities beyond myself. But who is the race anyway? Yes, there are literary schools and establishments, but certainly no central committee deciding who is in and who's out. Calibrating these influences is close to impossible, inevitably imprecise, and drains good energy from the work of writing poetry. Yet still, the question persists. How many African Americans have modified what and where we say or do because we think it would reflect badly on the race and in very real terms understand the heft and the power of that possibility? What if these considerations do not make us prudish, but rather indicate that there are familiar issues and degrees of self-censorship that we are faced with because of our history, and that our public acts are sometimes appropriately strategic? Such awareness can be separated, I think, from the fundamental work of internal liberation that is central to the poetic process. And I found that the work of Brooks and Hayden at that particular moment in our history was very useful. I want to tell you a little bit about an essay called The World According to Jet, that is Jet Magazine, or Notes Toward a Notion of Race Pride. I first read Jet Magazine, Black America's News Bible, out of Chicago, before I could read. My grandfather kept Jet magazines on a rack on the back of the door of the room where I slept when I visited his Harlem apartment. His archive went from the 50s forward, and those issues were my favorite thing to look at when I was there. I grew up in a home and in an era where integration was the gospel, and I was part of the great experiment. Most of my schoolmates were white. Jet fascinated me because it spoke unabashedly for a black nation in a time when Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about holding hands and singing that old Negro spiritual. Since I was, metaphorically and by inference, one of those black children holding hands and singing with the white children, Jet seemed to me to sound black notes from the lower frequencies, saying, go ahead, hold hands, but know who your people are, and don't let that contradict integration. Know who your people are. Know that it means something crucial, though who then could say precisely what as a child? To be of a people. Before I understood the difficulties of the enterprise of integration, that low rumble of race pride was sneaking its way into my subconscious to the part driven by compulsion that yearned for the world according to Jet. So by looking at the sort of old-fashioned race pride that Jet Magazine put forth, that made me able to think about, to meditate on what might a sort of new-fashioned race pride look like. There is something touching to me about the way in which Jet has been the caretaker of the curious tales of black life. Where else would you read about the Siamese twins joined at the head who were married in a double wedding, who were in Jet magazine because they were Siamese twins joined at the head and black? Jet was where I followed the story of Joanne Little, the black woman in prison who stabbed her white guard to death with an ice pick when he tried to rape her. And Jet is where maligned black America has often plied its case. Frank Willis, the black guard who discovered the telltale tape on the door of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Watergate and began the chain of events that brought down a corrupt presidency, was found by Jet magazine to be unemployed, living with his mother, and accused of stealing a $12 pair of sneakers. In the Jet exclusive, Willis said it was, quote, a total mix-up, which was all the magazine's prototypical readership would need to know, since black was always right in Jet. And so finally, when I talk a bit about in 1955, when 14-year-old Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi, Jet published the photograph of his bloated, ruined body that would burn itself into the minds of black America. Jet told the story Americans needed to know. We are past the legal gains of the civil rights era, but we still haven't overcome and are not even sure we are we. My problems with Jet are myriad, but I'm still a reader. With each instance in which the violation of a black person is made public in Jet's pages, I am able to think about whether it is violence or its ever-present possibility that unites us as black people. And I still revel in straight-up celebration of black glory. However tacky, however ephemeral those photos of black celebrities outside Ebony Jet headquarters in Chicago may be, I still hold on to them as I hold on to an idea that this thing called black culture and these people called black people can both be productively, complexly understood as nuanced entities whose acts and practices we hold to the challenge of criticism. And then finally, I want to say a little bit about the concluding essay, which is called Can You Be Black and Look at This? Reading the Rodney King Videos. And that sort of picks up on some of the ideas in the Jet essay. At the heart of this essay is a desire to find a language to talk about my people. My people is, of course, romantic language, but I keep returning to it as I think about the videotaped police beating of Rodney King, wanting the term to reflect the understanding that race is a complex fiction, but one that, needless to say, is perfectly real in at least some significant aspects of our day-to-day lives. There is no satisfactory terminology in current use adequate to represent how I am describing a knowledge and sense of African American group identification that is more expansive than the inevitable biological reductions of race and the artifactual constraints of culture. What do black people say to each other to describe their relationship to their racial group when that relationship is sometimes crucially forged by incidents of physical and psychic violence that boil down to the so-called fact of abject blackness? Put another way, how does an incident like King's 1991 beating consolidate group affiliations by making blackness an unavoidable, irreducible sign that, despite its abjection, leaves creative space for group definition and self-knowledge? This essay understanding the violence that has in large part characterized our history and underscored our vulnerability actually opens an avenue to get at what is articulate, resistant, and powerful in our tradition. Saying, I live in this body, remaining embodied, is the first step to transcending the limited and contorted expectations of those bodies and finding the rampant power that is our bequest. So black is always a metaphor, and black is always real. This essay has lived through some noteworthy changes in African American cultural studies. Essentialism has come under fire. To be essentialist, even strategically essentialist, to use Spivak's term, is to be hopelessly unsophisticated and behind the times, beyond the explicative powers of theory. It is worth emphasizing that my use of the term collective memory to think about how we encode responses to Rodney King, to Emmett Till, to witnessed acts of violence in Jim Crow South, to witness acts of violence in slavery, that to use that term collective memory is metaphorical. And I think that that's useful to remember. The 1990s in academia birthed a tricky trend to so theorize and construct and deconstruct identity so-called categories that some were apt to forget women and people of color themselves in bodies who wrote things that we urgently needed to read and who remained grossly underrepresented among the professoriate, women and people of color whose voices and actions in historical, political, and cultural life were too often marginalized, trivialized, forgotten, or erased. As race became a category and much intellectual energy was put into critiquing essentialism, the focus was lost on actual people of color, their voices and contributions, as well as, more practically, their importance of increasing our empowered presence on campuses and in other workplaces. The extreme reaches are not unimaginable. A gender studies without women, race studies without black people and other people of color, as though the political struggles of those very people who make those classes and books and programs and departments exist were no longer relevant, as though we were now on the proverbial level playing field. In my own case, as I began to come of age, I have felt the profound unease of misfitting the narrow descriptors of blackness from the mainstream as well as, more confoundingly, from black communities. What, besides certain phenotypical characteristics and certain progenitors, made me black? Why was racial identification and solidarity important if we were supposed to be post-civil rights and in the process of overcoming? How did my own embodied experiences as a black woman in a certain era and geography shape my sense of the possibilities as well as the limitations of blackness and help me understand myself collectively? How did the exploration of self in society in my own work take me to deeper articulations of racial possibilities? In the study of black culture, I found a bounty of rich, contradictory, disturbing, but ultimately sustaining responses to those questions. I found a way to interrogate and understand my own interior. Once called and now committed to that mother lode, I continue to struggle with its edifying conundrums.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Elizabeth Alexander discussing the black interior. Elizabeth, you've given us a huge number of ideas to turn around and look at. And it's hard for me to know where to start. I just like to put them all out there at once, but I won't do that. You open by talking about the value of the arts to capture something that has not yet been articulated and to open the door into the black interior, to give it expression. But you also suggest that the arts can be oppressive in some way, that they can be limiting, that they can close that door. And I wonder, could you say a little bit more about the way arts can be oppressive and repressive as well as expressive, particularly for African American artists?
Well, I wouldn't say that I find the arts to be oppressive. What I find to be oppressive and worthy of note is the way that after expecting artists to do what we expect them to do, which is to say the incredibly difficult and usually scarcely remunerated work of looking within and bringing forth something of power and beauty and value, that after we've asked our artists to do that incredibly hard and often marginalized work, to then say, it's not this enough, it's not that enough, it's not black enough, it doesn't fit with this program. That's what I think I find difficult from within our communities. I'm not saying it always happens, but sort of that's one shore. And then the other shore is to make art and try to have it find a place in the world, in publishing, for example, and to come up against so many stereotypes from the increasingly corporate and overwhelmingly white publishing industry, to say, oh, well, this isn't a book about, the hood. This isn't a book about some familiar stereotype. You don't fit. Who are you? You don't fit into this model of who my idea, as it has been fed to me in more popular culture, of what a black woman is supposed to be. You're not saying the things that I expect her to say. So your book is not resonating with me. Your work does not mean something to me. And in the visual arts, for example, to think about work that artists themselves might choose not to show, because they feel it could be misinterpreted, made perverse from one or the other sides of that narrow strait, which is where I look to artistic production, who manages to sort of navigate in between those two oppressive banks, if you will, to just sort of complete the metaphor.
So what does it take? What do you see it taking to navigate that narrow channel and come out with a powerful expression? What did it take you to do that?
Well, I think for me, I feel tremendously lucky that I know what it is that I ought to be doing, and that I have worked for a long time to find a way to continue to do that. So I think also to be an artist is, artists will tell you don't do it unless you have to, but at the same time, if you do have to, it is a glorious thing to know what you're supposed to be doing. And in a way, one of the beauties of writing poetry is that it's so far outside of the marketplace that it is never driven by market concerns. So you're freer to, sort of have that kind of exploration. Although there are always issues. You always have, every single African American writer I know has had to wrestle with how they are presented, what images are put on their book covers. All of these different turns where one of the cover for a book of mine that was suggested, it didn't make it to a cover, showed a picture of a rural southern black girl swinging in a back porch with a basket full of peaches. It was a lovely image. It had not one thing to do with me or with one word of any poem in the book. That was her idea, sort of a little rural southern black girl, of what a book by a black woman was supposed to be about. So, even in the best of circumstances, there are always those struggles, and I think it's very important to engage in those struggles and somehow find the peace and wisdom to be able to surround yourself with the very, perhaps, small group of people who are affirmed and who also will be challenging and engaged in, a wholesome way with critiquing the work. The artists I look at, they're an interesting, kooky bunch. Brooks, Robert Hayden, Jean-Michel Basquiat. These are people who have singularly made their own ways, with no particular template except that they were in very different lives, actually, in life circumstances, but that somehow they made that commitment to follow what they needed to say.
I've heard artists in more popular veins express similar concerns, and specifically I'm thinking of Spike Lee, who has said he's making Boys in the Hood films because that is what he has been stereotyped into making, and it's only after a certain number of successes and a certain amount of financial success that he's able to break out of that mold and make films that he feels express his vision of the world more clearly. Money is clearly part of the equation here, isn't it?
Well, and if you take the example of a Spike Lee, he was quite well into his career. He'd made at least 10 films when he wanted to make a film about the Million Man March, the movie Get on the Bus. And he couldn't get a studio to finance it, so he gathered a group of wealthy African-American men to finance the making of that film, at least in its initial phases. And I thought that was very innovative but important for people to know, especially when you look at all the dreadful, inhumane and soulless work that is put up there in, millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on work that only diminishes our sense of each other's humanity. That's important to bear in mind. But also, I think, to take as a positive example, Spike Lee saying, okay, I'll do it myself. I'll figure out a way to do it myself. It's not always easy, but that's what he did. And I think that's also in the tradition of a lot of of Jet Magazine, of a lot of black independent presses, of all of the independent movements that often can't get the same distribution. They often don't look as beautiful and shiny, but people have always found ways to try to make their work out, to get out there But we need more of that, and we need more financial support, because people have also gotten very burnt out. If you look at, for example, Barbara Smith, the wonderful writer and activist and publisher, read what she has to say about women, what is it called? Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, that she founded with Audre Lorde, and how it literally ground her down and almost took her life. The physical work, I mean, when you're doing everything, I remember so vividly her writing about hauling the boxes of books up and down from the basement. I mean, doing everything to get those works out there, works that have nourished so many of us. You do wish that, the good fairy would swoop down and fund something as important as that.
I want to follow up on that and ask a more general gender-based question. How do you see the role of African American women artists as being like or different from male artists, African American male artists? And do you see that historical expectations, differences in gender expectations, play a role in the evolution of the role of the artist for men and women?
Well, certainly, and absolutely. But, for example, also, there's someone who I write about at some length in here, Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote a remarkable book, A Voice from the South, in 1893, a book that people need to know made Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk possible. Formally, it made Souls of Black Folk possible. Du Bois was still getting his education when Cooper wrote this book that laid forth a sort of black feminist agenda, 1893, right? She's talking about, in all sorts of different forms. The book is a quite wonderfully hybrid text that speaks sometimes in poetry, speaks sometimes in sort of high-flown rhetoric, speaks sometimes with historical information, to, I argue, formally make a space for this unimagined type. That is to say, the turn of the century African-American female intellectual. Nobody imagined her. Nobody could conjure up who she was. So Cooper, in a way out of the blue, but also at the same time, there were a lot of other African-American women's activist movements going on in the 1890s. It was a very fertile period. So she wasn't alone, but in the literary sphere, here she is saying, I'll make who I am exist in print. And then when you see, Du Bois called the Souls of Black Folk his fugitive pieces, the way that quite beautiful book is pieced together and doesn't necessarily fit tidily into any genre. But that's the book, and rightly, it's a book that should be a linchpin of African American literature and culture and history. But it's very rarely discussed in terms of its progenitors and in terms of also the women who he was working alongside. Du Bois indeed was a great man and a great man of the race, but the Anna Julia Coopers were great women of the race who have gotten short shrift. She became one of the first few African-American women, this is in the 1920s, to earn her PhD, which she did at the age of 67 at the Sorbonne with a dissertation on slavery that she wrote in French. She was very, very remarkable, but she also devoted her life, as was disproportionately true for African-American women of that education, to teaching, and to teaching young people, not to college teaching, but to high school teaching. The D.C. public schools eventually drove her out because she was too radical for them. But she was a very, very, very devoted educator. And I think that has so often been seen as the real role and purpose of black women.
As we climb.
That's right.
Ethic.
And that it is the women who are, and this remains true to a certain extent in the university today. If you look at, a lot of the really hard work of mentoring that is going on, it's disproportionately being done by African American women. And what does that mean when it's time to publish your book and go up for tenure and so forth and so on? So it's good work, it's valuable work, but it is not always valued as it should be.
Do you think the history of violence has some difference in some role in these different expectations?
Well, I do think, on the one hand, certainly I don't need to rehearse what we all know about the incredible vulnerability of black men in our society today. That is a given. But I do think also that sometimes that story has been told at the expense of talking about what it is that African American women have endured and overcome, right? Talking about rape that occurs behind closed doors is a little bit different from talking about lynching that occurs in public in front of everybody. And by the way, also women were lynched as well as men. And so what I'm really interested in is how is it that, our bodies have experienced this violence in our histories, and yet legally black women were considered unrapeable for many, many years. If it were ever to be prosecuted, it would have to have been in the years of slavery, and it wasn't prosecuted, as trespass against another man's property. Right? So if Bob owns Sally and John rapes Sally, legally Sally hasn't been raped. Legally, John has messed with Bob's property. So, what I think is really interesting is how is it over time that on the one hand there is this huge wellspring of knowledge that is physical, that is social, that is cultural, that we know. And concomitantly there is an overriding public discourse that says it didn't happen or it didn't happen like that. And how does that energy then convert itself, in the case of those with the artistic gift, into potent art?
You're listening to Elizabeth Alexander discussing the Black Interior. The floor is now open for audience questions. If you have questions, please come to the microphone in the aisle. And while you're thinking of questions, I have another one. One of the recurring themes in your book is the anthology or the collection. You've talked about several anthologies, several collections. You open with a description of the shelves in your mother's living room. And can you say something about that image and why it's important and how it plays out in different contexts?
The image of anthologies or collections, that's great, yeah. I've always been really fascinated by literary anthologies, especially by writers whose work in other genre I knew and cared about. So, because I think that anthologies sort of unwittingly reveal their authorship. You're supposed to be disappearing and letting these other voices show themselves, but at the same time, it's all about what's in, what's out, who's out, what version of, for example, in a poetry anthology, if you have a whole life's work to choose from. Are you going to take the avant-garde period? Are you going to take the militant period? And Hughes himself is a really interesting case study with that too, how a lot of his very, very explicitly political work and his communist work and all of that work is not usually put in anthologies until very recently. It's more a jazzy, bluesy Langston Hughes that is the one who we are told to remember. So it feels like a sort of unwitting way of seeing further who writers are. And similarly, with the description of my mother's living room, that's in an essay that talks about the presentational nature of living rooms and how living rooms reveal the sort of subconscious of a family, of a household, and how that has particular resonance in African American life, where so much of our life is presumed to be public. Right? If you even think of the adjective public, usually whenever it's attached to anything, we assume that it's talking about black people, public schools, public education, public housing, public. So, I thought that by looking at living rooms, starting with this conversation about my mother's living room and then getting into a conversation about paintings of living rooms paintings with living rooms in them by black artists, I wanted to just look at what was happening and how that kind of unwittingly gave us a sense of space that was arranged, was artful in the way that the living room is a presentation space, but at the same time unwittingly said many, many very detailed things about the internal life of the people who occupied that space. And that sort of goes along with the anthologies.
Another thing you talk about with anthologies is how they decontextualize the objects that are put into them, the objects that have been collected, and what that taking out of context does. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, it's sort of a necessary evil, right? Because an anthology is what it is. I mean, it is a selection, and I am very grateful for anthologies myself because I can name a half a dozen that have been incredibly important to me. You can't go out and buy or take out from the library 25 books when you're just learning about poetry. You go to an anthology, you see who you like, you find out more. So I appreciate their function. But, for example, in a conversation about the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, edited by Henry Louis Gates and Nellie McKay, I try to create a more nuanced conversation, again, about what this period called the 60s and the Black Arts Movement was all about. The Black Arts Movement is kind of the banner headline in a lot of contemporary conversations about, I call it the Afro-politics, that even with my students, they know about the Black Arts Movement, they know about afros, they know about dashikis, but I'm saying that's all well and good, but let's have a complicated conversation about 67, 68, 69. And what I found interesting in the Norton Anthology is that while I totally appreciate the need to make a somewhat tidy conversation, because that's what anthologies do, at the same time, a lot of the women writers who in fact published their first work in 1968, it was an amazing year for African American women poets, first books by Lucille Clifton, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Carolyn Rogers. These women are blasting on the scene. But in the Norton, they don't get talked about till the 70s in the section called Black Feminism. And so what I'm trying to say is the conversation was more complicated when it was happening, and that is actually a very, very important, because, accurate literary historiography is important, but also I think because when we are calling young people into the present of consciousness, activism, and deep knowledge, I think that we only serve them well if we make sure that they understand the complexities and differing opinions and struggles that were going on in a particular time period, and not just a neatly streamlined version in which there is no tussle and there's no raggedness, because that's where thinking happens. That's how work gets done.
Yes, questions. Surely you have questions. I can ask questions all night, but you have your chance now. While you frame it, I'll ask another one, and the word frame is used intentionally. You talk also about frames and the role of framing, which struck me as similar to the role of anthologizing, but talk a little bit more about drawing frames and creating identities with frames.
And I'm trying to remember with whose work I speak about frames and framing.
Well, it recurs throughout, but you talk about framing to make it safe, to make an image art, and therefore to desexualize it or take away its threat, to civilize it, to make it something comfortable. And framing has a dual role, really.
Well, I think what I would want to say to that is that the book really puts together a kind of motley gallery of examples. And I mean that to compliment my own work, I mean that to say that, I'm looking at poems, the very, very detailed work of someone like a Gwendolyn Brooks or someone like a Michael Harper, whose work I talk about at great length. I have a whole section on films talking about Denzel Washington's career. So that's sort of how do you get from Gwendolyn Brooks to Denzel Washington. But I think, again, in thinking of, that idea of framing or presentation, what was fascinating to me about Washington is that for someone who has had a black actor who is both tremendously skilled and who's had the degree of mainstream success that Washington has had, which is quite extensive. I thought that I was surprised to see how fruitfully I could schematize his career. I began to think to myself, I wonder what Denzel Washington has said no to. Because if you think of the black actors who you could speak about in the same conversation with him, Denzel Washington, Danny Glover, Lawrence Fishburne, Samuel Jackson, maybe Don Cheadle, although he doesn't have quite a big a body as work. But these commercially successful, very, very skilled black male actors of this generation. Samuel Jackson has been in 5 billion movies, so it's harder to look at the substantive ones when you're wading through, the one where he's in the plaid golfing shorts the whole time, or the one where, the very, very, very trivial movies. And what I thought was fascinating about Washington is that his whole career was a way of talking about, I think about him as being post-Poitiers, but not possible without Poitiers, which is to say that he's very much of an affirmative action era. He charts the work. His movies are about men in the workplace. His movies, look at how many movies he's done with black men at all levels of the military, where so many black men disproportionately are, of black men dealing with on-the-job kinds of issues, and also with black men who are in the so-called bad boy mode, which, when Washington won the Oscar the same year that Halle Berry did, there were some black people who were upset because they said, well, they give it to Halle Berry when she takes off her clothes, and they give it to Denzel Washington when he plays a corrupt man, a bad man, not a very positive image, if you will. But I actually saw that as a moment of progress, because I think that the pressure to always perform and act and represent that kind of nobility, to never have an escape valve, to never feel that you can express your sexuality because it's going to be misconstrued or seen as instantly monstrous. That is, frankly, one of the reasons that so many black men die of stress-related diseases. This incredible straitjacket of being seen as a contained and containable monster. So I think that if expressively in the very popular culture we have a black male actor who says, I'm going to play a rotten character. I'm not going to be Poitiers because Poitiers made it possible for me to be able to be part of the human spectrum, which is, after all, what we expect from our artists, to explore the whole human spectrum. I found that very interesting, and so while keeping in mind the particularities of what does it mean, the circumstances with which you come to a book of poems, the circumstances in which you go out to the movies and see something popular in the Cineplex, the circumstances with which you go into an art gallery and see a painting, are all different ways of consuming art. But I think at the same time you can sort of put all of the objects in the same room and think about how some of these themes play themselves out across those genres.
Would you come right up here in the aisle to the microphone? Yeah.
Do you think that...
wait till you get there. Okay.
Yeah. Do you think that black artists and writers and performers should even concern themselves with the white opinion, the mainstream opinion, like you just mentioned, Denzel? Do you think we should even concern ourselves with the white pat on the back, which is like the Grammy and the Oscar, and white critics who talk about like Little John and the East Side Boys and stuff like that? Should black people even concern themselves with white opinion at all as far as what we create?
Mm-hmm. Well, in 1925, Langston Hughes, nobody has said it better than Langston Hughes said it, and he was then a man just in his early 20s in The Negro Writer and the Racial Mountain, when he said, if white people are pleased with what we do, fine. If white people are not pleased, that's fine too. If black people are pleased, fine. If black people are not pleased, that's fine too. We stand atop the racial mountain, free within ourselves. And I think that's just a mantra. I think that's just got to be a mantra. What does it mean to really, really, really look within? Now, I don't have the same expectations of a zillion-dollar movie star that I do of a poet, right? But at the same time, what I would wish for, what I would encourage on people is that ultimately, and sometimes that means that maybe there's work that doesn't get published for a very, very long time. The title poem of my first book, which is the poem that I'm most known for, was rejected for years. I'm not going to speculate why. I don't know why. But the point of the matter is, that's what'll be on my little teeny tiny obituary, is that poem. And it was rejected for years. So did that change how I felt about the poem? It couldn't, because part of what, people need to develop as they're coming of age as artists is, what is that internal voice that says when you have achieved something, when you have expressed yourself to the best of your ability. Then, once that act is complete, then the act of trying to make it find a place in the world, you sort of put on a different hat, to try to get your work out there.
Yeah, what kind of made me think about that, how you were talking about, it was a conversation, probably in Writer Circle, but just in the community in general, about the Holly Berry role in Monsters Ball. And I think it was more framed around because, white people recognized and kind of held it up, and they talked, and Denzel won it, and that, they talked about Sidney Poitier and such. But I think that what I kind of noticed that even the dialogue about black film was framed, it kind of became like a national dialogue due to white recognition. That's kind of where I was going with. I'm not saying you're supposed to write. I wasn't really asking whether you should write towards white expectations. I'm just thinking about the sister Carl Walker in her art, how a lot of the black criticism she got was due to not so much because black people were this is horrible. It's kind of more in the context of these images as opposed to, a mainstream opinion. And kind of like even with comedy, like what we say amongst ourselves can be accepted, but once, everybody else gets in on it, it becomes, a little different. That's kind of what my question was.
Well, yes, and that's why I think it's really important, whoever our is, that's why I think it's really important to have our conversations. And I really emphasize whoever our is, because, it may be only a small nugget of people who you are talking to, although one of the really beautiful gifts that has come my way from years of writing and publishing poetry is that here in this, little teeny tiny marketplace, the poems and the readers do find each other. And the people who care about poetry care passionately about poetry. The people who care about black art and care that it be richly representative care passionately about that. So I think that is where, succor is to be found in making those conversations, however it is that we can make them, and just insisting on listening to ourselves and framing the terms of the conversation ourselves. And, that sometimes, of course, leads to publishing efforts, which I must say are, partial as I am to the printed word, in the whole, internet era, there are all kinds of ways that people are sharing their opinions on the arts in a flash. I also like to remind people that Du Bois published over his very, very, very long life. If you average out, he started, keeping his papers when he was 12 or something. And over his whole long, almost century-long life, if you averaged out his publication record, he published on the average of once a week. That includes, letters to the editor, but once a week, which says to me that every day Du Bois sat down and asked himself, what do I think about this? And that he developed the confidence to articulate that as best he could. And some things would become the souls of black folk that everybody in the whole world's read, and some things would be, something that maybe only a few people saw. But that was his discipline. And I think that discipline is what we need to commit to, because you could absolutely grind yourself to dust worrying about the inanity of the general conversation about black people and get very confused and tired. Yeah.
Hi there. I just want to thank you for being here and sharing your time and your new work with us. I really appreciate it. And I guess my first question, if I can try to wrap it up succinctly, I was just curious when you were talking about how, blackness, as it is understood, tends to be this kind of flat, monolithic way of being, which oftentimes was adapted from, as I see it, decades of white people saying this is what black people will be, and it kind of then becoming part of the public culture. And then, I feel like black people have always fought that in a revolutionary way to put up their own depiction of what we are, and it's kind of been this struggle. And I guess my first question is, at what point, because at the end of the day, when we describe blackness, it is really just us describing this human experience that we all go through. And I'm just wondering, at what point in time does it not become this fight? And I don't even know if that is possible within my lifetime, but I'm just curious if it ever becomes a part of the public sphere where it's not just, it has to be one thing. I know I'm not describing this very well, but does that make sense? I just wonder if it's always going to be this dichotomy.
Well, who knows? I mean, and in a way, it's a good question, but I think it's a question to move beyond. Only because how can we know? And how can we contribute except by doing the work? I mean, it is very important to ask those questions and have those wishes. And certainly, I mean, there are many, many, many ways in which African American progress can be measured. So I don't mean to suggest that, we're just in the same old, sinkhole that we've been in for hundreds and hundreds of years, because that wouldn't be quite right. And I do think, for example, in African American poetry right now, we are full-blown, full-fledged in the middle of what must be called a renaissance. It measured by the incredible diversity of voices that are making their way to all kinds of different publications. At black presses like Third World Press, at historically white presses like Grey Wolf Press, my press, other presses, in MFA programs, teaching, starting community education projects. I mean, this is a really, really remarkable flowering moment for black poetry, and I think what's remarkable about it, too, is that a number of our elders are still with us and productive. So you have collected poems by people like Jay Wright, Michael Harper, Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Lucille Clifton. And these people are still making work and are cross-pollinating with the younger poets who are coming along now. So I always want to remind people of that as well, to say that there is a lot going on, but I think I look at it now, after having done this for many years as it happens, from the perspective of what do you do with, the bowl of energy that you start each day with? Where are you going to put that energy? Are you going to put it toward speculating about what we can't know about? Or are you going to put it toward contributing to change? That's just pragmatic, I think, though it took me time to come to that. Yeah.
You talked about reading Jet magazine when you were a little girl. Who were your poet heroes when you were a girl? Who did you aspire to talk to in your poetry?
Well, the first, I suppose it even began before poetry per se, with just having an ear for storytelling and the way that people in my immediate circle, in my family, put language together. And that just seemed remarkable to me and beautiful to me, the way that they spoke and put language together. And, I would beg them, as children do, to tell this story, to tell that story. I always was compelled to tell my dreams when I woke up in the morning. So whatever that kind of will to narrative was, that was there. Then the first poems that were important to me were the moderns. In high school, we read Louis Untermeyer's Modern American Poetry. So many poets, not all of my generation, but of an older generation, came to modern poetry through that book. And so I think that instilled in me a really, really potent love of the image. and a real attention to what does it mean to think of the image as a crafted and almost tangible kind of thing. Then I think Walt Whitman and his sort of breathlessness, his enthusiasm, his democraticness, which was very important to me, and the way that that long and inclusive line formally mirrored his politics, was a very, very important example. And then finally, I still am often with the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks and Robert Hayden. They are just both very remarkable to me. And again, with Brooks, I don't think there is a more innovative technician who has written poetry. Really, really, really remarkable. And she is so clearly, she's a great example of universality from specificity of place. All of her poems practically take place on the same block on the south side of Chicago, and yet they are infinite, and yet the interiors, if you will, of her characters are infinite. And her language possibilities are quite infinite. Hayden, finally, for, again, craftsmanship, for humanity, for sheer beauty, and for just a kind of a depth that his work has, is someone who I go back to again and again. So those are some of the people. Of course, there's always a rotating list.
These are the A list, the
That's
permanent
definitely
A
the A
list.
list. Yes.
Okay. I don't want to put you on the spot because you didn't come here to read. But if you would read or recite one of your poems, I would like very much if you could do that. I don't know if you
great.
can, and if you can't, please say no.
That's a nice request. Wish I'd have had it a few hours ago because I would have brought something with me. But, and I do know poems of mine. How terrible. I'm stymied.
Not terrible at all.
Okay, well, theoretically I would love to, and nothing is coming immediately to mind. But I will say this, that this is my first book of prose. It's one that marinated for a very, very long time. I've been thinking about these and writing these essays over many, many years. And what they remind me of now that all is said and done is two things. One, that personally for me, being a poet is quite fundamentally where I live artistically, and that feels to me to be a craft and a practice that is full of infinite possibility, infinite challenges, and still the best way to reach across the void that separates human beings. That if we can be that precise with our language and offer language so precise to each other across the void, that's the only way, actually, that we're going to move forward, and that poetry models that for us. And also, again, now that the book is said and done, to just emphasize the importance, as I began this with, of looking to culture, of not thinking that culture is someplace where you just go to feel good and to escape, all of the horrible things that continue to happen every day and that you can bet are going to continue to happen in this incredible mess of a world that we're in. That culture is where we can imagine what we aren't supposed to imagine. And that if we stay too much stuck in all of the increasingly corporatized media that barrages us with too many choices and too much stuff, that we will not have the time or the space to imagine what we need to save ourselves. So that's about poetry.
We'll save ourselves with poetry.
And the arts, I think that's one of the things. I mean, Adrienne Rich in the Times today wrote a beautiful letter where she said, even more so than it was in response to an article about money, the big $1 zillion that the Poetry Foundation had, and what Rich said was, that's all well and good, but even more than that, what we need is a more just society where money is given to people to help them. People need jobs, people need shelter, people need safety. And that fundamentally, and she said, once you have those conditions, then you will be supporting poetry. So it's even deeper than that, and of course she would be the one to say it so eloquently.
Thank you, Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this program entitled The Black Interior, recorded in April 2004, send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138. Or call 617-495-2727, or you can visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Pat Zerke. Thanks for joining us.